To my family, I was always the quiet one with a cute little antique shop. They had no idea that my hobby had quietly made me a $20 million fortune. And then at my parents' 40th anniversary party, my own sister exposed everything. Within an hour, I wasn't their daughter or their sister anymore. I became a bank, and they showed up to make a withdrawal, demanding $5 million. But this isn't just a story about money. It's about the moment you realize that some family love comes with a price tag. It's about the life-altering power you can find in a single word no. This is my story. There's a language in forgotten things that most people don't hear. It's a quiet dialect spoken in the faint scent of old paper and cedar, in the cool, smooth surface of worn silver, in the dozen tiny scratches on a wooden tabletop that tell the story of 100 family dinners. My shop Echoes and Artifacts is my library of these stories. Tucked away in Portland's Pearl District, it's less a business and more a sanctuary, a curated collection of conversations between the past and the present. My name is Eleanor Vance, but everyone who knows me, everyone who really knows me, which is a shorter list than you might think, calls me Ellie. From the outside, my life is as unassuming as the faded brick facade of my building. I live in the loft apartment upstairs, drive a decade-old Subaru, and my daily uniform consists of comfortable jeans, soft linen shirts, and the lingering pleasant dust of history. To my family, this is the full picture Ellie, the quiet one, the proprietor of a cute hobby that somehow manages to pay the bills. It's a simple, uncluttered narrative, and for years, I've let them believe it. The truth is far more complicated. The truth is that a few days ago, my private wealth manager, a discreet man named Mr. Albright, sent me a single-line email. It wasn't congratulatory, merely informational, which is why I like him. It stated that my portfolio had, thanks to a few wise investments in emerging tech, officially surpassed the $20 million mark. $20 million. The number feels foreign, like a name in a language I don't speak. It doesn't fit in the quiet, dusty world I've built. It certainly doesn't fit the version of myself my family holds so dear. And the foundation of that fortune is my most closely guarded secret, a story I tell no one. It is my own artifact, my own echo of a past decision that I can neither change nor fully reconcile. It happened nearly a decade ago. I was just starting out running the shop on a shoestring budget and a surplus of passion. An elderly man came in smelling of mothballs and quiet grief. His wife had recently passed, and he was selling off the contents of their attic. Among the dusty furniture and boxes of china was a small leather-bound trunk. Inside, bundled in twine, were the letters and diaries of his great-grandfather, a Union soldier during the Civil War. I knew instantly that they were special. The paper, the ink, the elegant cursive, it all sang to me. I paid him his asking price, a few $100s, which felt like a fortune to me at the time. He was just happy to have the space cleared. But as I spent the next few months poring over those documents, a different kind of value revealed itself. The soldier wasn't a general or a famous figure, but his prose was magnificent. His observations of war and life and loss were breathtakingly raw. He was a historian without an audience. I knew with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying that I was holding something of immense historical importance. And here lies the heart of my secret, the source of a quiet, persistent guilt. I didn't track the old man down to tell him. I didn't offer him a share of the profits. I sold the collection to a private discerning collector for a sum of money that changed my life forever. It was the seed from which my entire fortune grew. Legally, I had done nothing wrong. But morally, that's a conversation I have with myself in the dark hours of the night. That transaction is the reason I live so quietly, so far beneath my means. It's why I feel a constant humming need to use my money for good, to somehow balance the scales of that long-ago decision. My wealth doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a debt. This is my secret world. But the other world, the one of family obligations and carefully constructed roles, is never far away. It arrived this morning, as it always does, in the form of an email from my mother, Linda. The subject line was a series of exclamation points surrounding the words, "Big reminder, hi sweetie," it began. Just a little nudge about Dad's and my 40th anniversary party this Saturday. The Rose Garden at 7, dress nice. Kate is handling all the details, so you know it will be perfect. Can't wait to see you. Love, Mom. A familiar weight settled in my chest. The party. I had been trying to push it to the back of my mind. It wasn't a celebration, not really. It was a performance. A production staged and directed by my older sister, Catherine. Kate, in which we all had our roles to play. My father, Robert, the stoic retired engineer. My mother, the anxious, smiling peacemaker. Kate, the brilliant, successful lawyer, the radiant star at the center of our small solar system. And me, Ellie, the quiet, artsy, slightly disappointing moon orbiting in the distance. I closed the email and looked around my shop at the gentle light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Here I was, a curator, a historian, a storyteller. Here I was the authority. Out there at that party, I would be a story told by someone else, a character whose lines were written long ago. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a tremor of rebellion, a quiet voice in the back of my mind, wondering what would happen if I refused to play my part. The afternoon before the party was spent in a state of quiet ritual. I moved through my shop, straightening a stack of leather-bound books, repositioning a porcelain teacup so it caught the light just so. It was a form of meditation, a way of anchoring myself in my own world before stepping into theirs. The preparation wasn't about them, it was about me. I chose my armor carefully, a simple deep teal dress that fell just below the knee. It was elegant but forgettable, a color that could blend into the background. My only accessory was a silver locket worn smooth with age that I'd found years ago in a dusty estate sale. It was my silent rebellion, a piece of a stranger's history worn close to my heart. My goal for the evening was simple: survive. Surviving my family meant surviving Kate. The contrast between us was a chasm. It was best illustrated by a video call I'd had with her 2 days prior. I was in my workshop carefully restoring the finish on an old writing desk, my hands smudged with oil and wax. She, on the other hand, appeared on my screen from her corner office, a sleek, minimalist space with a panoramic view of the city skyline behind her. "Just making sure you're all set for Saturday," she'd said, her tone bright and efficient. "Mom said she reminded you. Please, Ellie, try to look the part. No faded cardigans." She'd smiled, a quick, sharp flash of perfect white teeth. It was the same smile she'd given me years ago when she'd visited my newly opened shop. She'd scanned the crowded shelves, the carefully curated chaos, and declared, "It's just adorable, Ellie. A really sweet hobby." The word hobby was a tiny poisoned dart thrown with such practiced ease that to protest would have made me seem petty. The implication was clear. What I did was trivial, a child's game, while what she did, litigating, acquiring, winning, was the work of an adult. Her life was a meticulously curated exhibit of success. Her husband, Mark, was a partner at a rising tech firm. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl, attended the most exclusive private school in Portland. Their home in Lake Oswego was a modern masterpiece of glass and steel, frequently featured in her flawless Instagram feed, alongside photos of charity galas and ski trips to Aspen. It was a perfect life, polished to a high sheen for public consumption. Yet the last time I'd seen them at a brief family dinner a few months back, I'd noticed a hairline crack in the facade. Mark had seemed distracted, his eyes constantly flicking to his phone. And Kate had been talking with a brittle, almost frantic energy about a new round of angel investing, a subject she'd never shown interest in before. It was a fleeting observation, a discordant note in a familiar symphony, but it had stayed with me. My phone rang as I was putting on my shoes, and my mother's name lit up the screen. I answered, already knowing what was coming. "Ellie, honey, are you on your way?" Linda's voice was a familiar blend of warmth and anxiety. "Almost, Mom. Just getting ready." "Oh, good. I'm so excited. It's going to be such a lovely evening. Just try to have a good time, okay? And please try to get along with your sister. You know how much this means to your father and me. I know how much appearances mean to you," I thought. But I said I will, Mom. "I'll see you soon." I hung up, the weight of her plea settling on my shoulders. My mother wasn't a bad person. She was simply a woman who had dedicated her life to avoiding conflict. She was the family's frantic stage manager, constantly smoothing down curtains and adjusting lights, terrified that the audience might see the mess backstage. My father was different. Robert Vance was a man of quiet precision. An engineer by trade, he understood systems, structures, cause, and effect. In the rare moments I had him to myself, he'd visit the shop and his curiosity would bloom. He'd pick up a sextant or a complex wooden puzzle box and ask intelligent, insightful questions. How did you verify its provenance, Eleanor? What's the half-life of this particular varnish? In those moments I felt seen. But in the presence of my mother and Kate, he would retreat, a quiet, stoic man completely outshone by the supernova of his eldest daughter. He loved me, I knew, but he was intimidated by Kate's brand of success, a language of power and money he didn't quite speak. I stood by the large window of my loft, looking down at the Friday evening energy of the Pearl District. People were heading to art galleries, to independent bookstores, to craft breweries. They were living authentic lives, messy and real. My life here among my silent, story-filled objects was authentic. The world I was about to step into was a gilded cage, beautiful from the outside, but a cage nonetheless. I went to these events not out of obligation, not anymore. I went because a tiny, stubborn part of me held on to a flicker of hope, a foolish belief that maybe just this once they would see me. Not the hobbyist, not the little sister, not the family project. Just me, Ellie. And with that fragile hope as my only shield, I picked up my keys and walked out the door. The restaurant was exactly as I'd pictured, a symphony of muted colors, clinking crystal, and hushed, important-sounding conversations. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the Willamette River, its dark water reflecting the glittering lights of the Portland skyline. About 50 people, my parents' closest friends, and a handful of family mingled on an outdoor terrace, champagne flutes in hand. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the carefully maintained illusion of effortless grace. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly suffocating. My mother spotted me the moment I stepped onto the terrace. She detached from a conversation and swept towards me, her face a mask of practiced hostess charm. Ellie, you're here. She hugged me tightly, a brief, tense embrace. You look so pretty, honey, she whispered. But her eyes did a rapid, critical scan of my dress, my hair, my simple silver locket. It wasn't a compliment. It was a sigh of relief that I hadn't embarrassed her. My father was next. He extricated himself from a conversation about golf swings and gave my hand a firm shake, his palm warm and dry. Glad you could make it, Eleanor, he said, his smile genuine but fleeting, quickly swallowed by the social anxiety of the event. For that 1 second, though, I felt a flicker of the man who visited my shop, the man who understood provenance and history. Then he was gone, absorbed back into the crowd. And then there was Kate. She and Mark held court near the center of the terrace, a gravitational point around which others orbited. Kate was radiant in a sharp crimson dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She radiated a kind of high-gloss power that made people lean in eager for a sliver of her attention. She saw me, and her smile widened, a brilliant, conquering smile. Ellie, you made it, she called out, gliding over. Her voice was loud enough for those nearby to hear, a public display of sisterly affection. I was just telling Susan about your little shop. So charming. She introduced me to a woman with meticulously coiffed hair who gave me a polite, vacant look that said she had already forgotten my name. The performance continued for what felt like an eternity. I drifted between conversations, a ghost at the feast, offering non-committal murmurs and pleasant smiles. I was just beginning to think I might actually survive the night unscathed when it happened. The moment that would unravel everything. Kate was deep in conversation with Susan, animatedly describing her children's recent trip to a ski resort. Oh, you have to see the picture of Leo on the bunny slope. He was just... She fumbled in her clutch purse. Oh, for heaven's sake. My phone's dead. Her eyes, bright and calculating, landed on me. Ellie, sweetie, be a lifesaver. Can I borrow your phone for a sec? Real quick, I just want to pull up my Instagram. A cold knot formed in my stomach. It was such a simple, innocuous request. To refuse would be churlish and strange, drawing far more attention than just complying. My mind raced, but I could see no graceful way out. The first rule of surviving a Vance family gathering was, do not make a scene. With a reluctant smile, I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and handed it over. Thanks, you're the best, she said, her attention already focused on the screen, her thumb swiping with practiced speed. I stood there a silent observer as she showed Susan the photos. I watched her laugh, her head tilted back, the perfect picture of a proud mother. It was a moment like so many others where I was merely a prop in the grand play of her life. But then the play stopped. The screen of my phone, angled just so under the terrace lights, suddenly lit up. A banner notification slid down from the top. It was from the secure app my wealth manager used. My heart stopped. I didn't even have to read the words. I knew what it was. But I read them anyway, the text seeming to burn into the cool night air. Congratulations. Your portfolio has officially surpassed the $20 million milestone. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss strategy. Time seemed to slow down. The murmur of the party faded to a dull roar. Kate's laughter caught in her throat. Her smile didn't vanish. It froze, becoming a brittle porcelain thing. Her eyes darted from the screen to my face, and in them I saw a rapid-fire sequence of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then a sharp, piercing look of intense calculation. The mask of the doting sister dissolved, replaced by the face of a litigator who had just found a critical piece of evidence. My own blood ran cold. This was it. The secret I had guarded for a decade, the quiet, complex truth of my life, had just been laid bare by a push notification. My voice was a strained whisper. My phone. Kate. I held out my hand, which was trembling almost imperceptibly. She handed it back without looking at it, her gaze locked on mine. Her expression was unreadable now, a careful professional blankness. But I could feel the energy coming off her, a palpable hum of shock and furious thought. As I slid the phone back into my purse, she leaned in close, her voice a low, sharp hiss that cut through the noise of the party meant for my ears alone. We need to talk. Privately. The transition from the terrace to the hallway was jarring. One moment, I was surrounded by the warm glow of fairy lights and the gentle hum of 50 conversations. The next, I was in a cool, sterile corridor, bathed in the impersonal, recessed lighting of a commercial building. The sounds of the party were instantly muffled, leaving only the sharp, angry silence between my sister and me. Kate dropped my arm as if it were a snake. The gracious hostess persona she wore so effortlessly evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lights, leaving behind the chillingly focused face of a prosecutor who had just found her smoking gun. $20 million, she hissed, and the sound echoed slightly against the bare walls. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Are you kidding me, Eleanor? While we're out here working our asses off, grinding every single day, you've been sitting on a King Midas fortune playing shopkeeper in your dusty little hobbit hole. Every word was a carefully chosen barb, designed to diminish me, to make me feel small and fraudulent. The old Ellie, the one who lived in a constant state of apology for her own existence, would have flinched. She would have stammered, explained, tried to justify herself. But something inside me had snapped the moment that notification appeared on my screen. A core of stillness I didn't know I possessed took over. I looked at her, at the rage contorting her beautiful face, and I felt a strange, detached calm. I simply met her gaze and waited, my silence a void she didn't know how to fill. It was a language of authenticity, and in her world of calculated rhetoric, it was alien. My lack of reaction clearly unnerved her. A flicker of frustration, a brief flash of raw panic crossed her eyes before she expertly masked it. She was a strategist after all. If one line of attack failed, you simply pivot. I watched, fascinated by the mechanics of it, as her entire posture shifted. Her tensed shoulders relaxed. She took a half step closer and her voice dropped into a softer, more intimate register. She placed a hand on my arm, her touch now intended to feel like sisterly concern. Listen, Ellie. She began, her tone now syrupy with reason. I'm not mad. I'm just shocked and worried. A sum of money that large changes things. It brings complications. She was weaving a new narrative now, recasting herself as the protective older sister. This is an incredible opportunity, not just for you but for the entire family. Think of it, a real family legacy. We could establish a foundation, secure the futures of all our children, your future nieces and nephews. We can build something that lasts, something that matters. She's a storyteller just like me, I thought, with a sudden, startling clarity. But my stories are rooted in truth in the tangible past. Hers are fictions constructed for a singular purpose acquisition. She wasn't selling me a vision, she was building me a more beautiful cage. As if summoned by her very thoughts, Mark appeared at the end of the hall walking toward us with a purposeful stride that he probably thought looked casual. The smile on his face was broad and dazzling, but it didn't reach his eyes. Around them I could see the fine web of stress lines that hadn't been there a year ago. "There you are," he said, sliding an arm around my shoulder. The gesture felt heavy proprietary. He smelled of expensive cologne and quiet desperation. "Kate just told me the news. Ellie, that's... wow. Just wow." He shook his head in feigned disbelief. "We are so incredibly proud of you." "Proud of what? The number?" "You've never asked me a single substantive question about my work," my inner voice screamed. But I held my tongue, nodding as if I believed him. "You know," he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, "with this kind of capital you have to be smart. You can't just let it sit in a low-yield fund, it'll be eaten by inflation. You need to leverage it, make it work for you. For the family. We're looking at a few pre-IPO opportunities, very exclusive, that could triple that in 5 years." He rattled off a series of hollow corporate buzzwords, a language designed to impress and intimidate. To me it was just noise, the frantic chirping of a bird trying to distract from its empty nest. Before I needed to craft a reply, Kate tightened her grip on my other arm. "Come on," she commanded softly. "Mom and Dad need to know." I didn't resist. I felt a strange sense of dissociation as they escorted me, one on each side, back toward the low hum of the party. I was no longer a guest. I was an asset being brought to the negotiating table. They guided me to the quiet corner where my parents stood, looking slightly lost amidst the swirling social currents. "Mom, Dad," Kate said, her voice imbued with a somber importance. "Ellie has something to tell you." She fixed her gaze on me, a silent order to confess my success like a sin. I remained silent, letting the expectation hang in the air. My mother looked from Kate's grave face to my placid one, her own expression a mask of confusion. Finally, Kate let out an exasperated sigh. "Ellie has been extraordinarily successful. Her little shop has done very, very well for her." "Oh," my mother said, a tentative smile appearing. "That's wonderful, dear. We're so happy it's working out." Kate's eyes narrowed. "No, Mom. You don't understand." She leaned forward and whispered the number, a 2-word bomb dropped into the heart of their 40th anniversary. 20 million. The effect was devastating. My mother's breath hitched in a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if to keep her heart from escaping. My father's face, already etched with the quiet worries of his age, seemed to collapse inward. The color drained from his cheeks and he physically shrank, his shoulders slumping as he stared at me, then at Kate, then back at me. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a foreign language. The happy illusion of the evening shattered. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere around us, the subtle turning of heads, the quieting of nearby conversations. Our tense family huddle had become the evening's main attraction, and through it all I was still. I was no longer a daughter or a sister. I was a historian witnessing a primary event. I was documenting the precise moment when love became a line item, when concern became a negotiation. My silence wasn't passive, it was my research method. I was giving them the space, the stage, and the spotlight to show me exactly who they were. And they were giving me everything I needed. It was Mark who suggested we move to one of the restaurant's private dining rooms. He framed it as a way to give my parents a quiet place to sit down away from the noise of the party. But we all knew the truth. This was an escalation. The door clicked shut behind us with a heavy final sound, sealing the 5 of us in a small, tastefully decorated room that suddenly felt like a cage. The air, thick with the scent of expensive lilies from a vase on the table, became hard to breathe. The moment the door was closed, Kate dropped all pretense of civility. She paced the small space like a caged animal, her crimson dress a slash of angry color against the room's muted beige walls. "All right, Ellie." "Stop the act," she snapped, whirling to face me. "No more quiet, mysterious little sister. Let's have it. We're in trouble. Real trouble." I watched her, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I had moved beyond fear into a state of hyper-aware clarity. The firm is downsizing. She continued, her voice cracking with a stress she could no longer conceal. And Mark? She gestured towards her husband, who was now staring intently at the floor. His company is a ghost. It's been running on fumes and venture capital debt for a year. The house, the kids' school, the cars. All of it. She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It's about to go up in smoke. Here it was. The truth beneath the flawless Instagram feed. The rot under the gilded surface. She stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, her eyes boring into mine. There was no plea for help, no hint of humility. There was only a raw, desperate demand. "We need $5 million," she said, the words stark and ugly in the quiet room. "It's not a gift. It's not even really a loan. Think of it as an investment. An investment in this family. In your nephew's futures." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. My silence, which had so far been my shield, was now being interpreted as weakness, as an invitation to push harder. Mark, seeing his opening, finally looked up. His face was pale, his affable mask gone, replaced by a sneer of resentment. "Oh, come on. Ellie, don't act so holy," he scoffed. "It's not like you earned it, not really. We all know how you made your money. Dumb luck on old junk you bought from senile people." The insult was crude, but it was Kate who sharpened it into a weapon. She stepped forward, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper aimed directly at the heart of my deepest insecurity. "He's right," she said, her eyes glinting with triumph. She knew she had found my weak spot. "You owe this family. You hit the jackpot on someone else's history on a lucky break. It's time you took on some real responsibility. That money isn't really yours in the same way the money I make is mine. You didn't bleed for it. You didn't sacrifice." Her words struck home, a physical blow that resonated with the guilt I'd carried for a decade. For a fleeting second, I almost believed her. My entire life she had defined the terms of success, and now she was defining the terms of my wealth, branding it as illegitimate, unearned, and therefore hers for the taking. I looked to my parents for a lifeline, for some sign of fairness, of defense. It was a fool's hope. My mother, her face streaked with tears, reached a trembling hand toward me. "Ellie, darling," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "She's your sister. Families are supposed to help each other. We have to keep this family together." She was reciting the lines from her lifelong script, the peacemaker's desperate prayer, completely oblivious to the fact that the family she was trying to save was a fiction. But it was my father's reaction that truly broke my heart. Robert Vance, the engineer, the man of logic and structure, said nothing. He sat slumped in his chair, his hands clasped so tightly on the table his knuckles were white. He stared at his hands, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. His silence was not neutrality. It was a verdict. It was the terrified silence of a man who would rather watch one child be devoured than stand up to the other. It was the loudest, most painful betrayal of all. I looked around the table at each of them. Kate, her face a mask of avarice. Mark, a hollow man consumed by his own failures. My mother weeping for an illusion. And my father, a monument to his own cowardice. I saw it all with perfect, horrifying clarity. They had spent my entire life building this cage for me, with their expectations, their dismissals, their judgments. And now that they'd discovered something of value inside it, they were demanding the key. This was the moment, the breaking point, the end of the story they had written for me. The silence that followed my father's abdication was a living thing. It filled the small, airless room, pressing in on us, thick and heavy with the dust of unspoken resentments and freshly shattered illusions. I could hear my mother's soft, hitching sobs. I could see the frantic, desperate calculation in Mark's eyes as he stared at me, his last hope for a bailout. I watched Kate, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her face flushed with a furious, expectant entitlement. And I saw my father, a man I loved, who had retreated so far into his own quiet shame that he had become a ghost at his own anniversary party. They were all looking at me, waiting for the final collapse, for the tears, for the dutiful daughter to finally break and surrender to the collective force of their need. For a long moment, I let them wait. I took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the sterile, lily-scented air deep into my lungs, holding it, and then letting it out. It felt like the first clean breath I'd taken in 35 years. In that single moment of stillness, I felt the tectonic plates of my life shift. I was standing on a precipice, and the next word I spoke would not be a step, but a leap. I would either fall back into the cage they had built for me, or dive headfirst into an unknown future. I chose the future. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't tremble. It was a sound I barely recognized, a voice honed in the quiet solitude of my shop, polished by a decade of self-reliance. It was calm, clear, and as cool and solid as Riverstone. No. The word was a single perfect note of defiance in a symphony of dysfunction. It wasn't loud or angry. It was absolute, a closed door, a final verdict. The impact in the room was instantaneous and profound. My mother's weeping stopped with a choked gasp. Mark physically recoiled as if I had struck him, and Kate, who had been poised for victory, stared at me as if I'd just spoken in a foreign tongue. No, she stammered the word, a disbelieving squeak. Her carefully constructed reality was malfunctioning. What do you mean, no? I raised my eyes from the table and looked directly at her. The fear I'd always felt under her gaze was gone, replaced by a weary clarity. I said no. I repeated, my voice even. And I need you to understand why. It's not because of the money. You can't comprehend that, but it's the truth. It's because for my entire life, not once have you ever truly seen me. You have only ever seen what you wanted me to be, or what I could do for you. A quiet placeholder. A convenient opposite to shine against. I am not a failed version of you, Kate. I am the complete version of me, and I will not apologize for that anymore. You don't see me now. You see a bank vault. And the answer is no. My gaze shifted to my parents, the two people whose approval I had once craved like oxygen. I love you both, I said. And the words were true, which made them ache with a terrible sadness. But I cannot live in the shadow of your disappointment any longer. I cannot keep trying to be the daughter you can be proud of in the way you understand pride. That person doesn't exist. I pushed my chair back from the table. The legs scraped a short, sharp protest against the polished floor, the only aggressive sound in the room. I stood up, feeling a strange lightness, as if I had shed a heavy, invisible coat that I hadn't realized I was wearing. The party is over, I said softly to no one in particular. At least for me. I turned and walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their stunned, uncomprehending silence on my skin. I walked out of the private room back into the main area of the restaurant. The party was thinning out, small groups of my parents' friends lingering over coffee, their laughter sounding jarringly normal. As I passed a table near the exit, a woman my mother had known for years caught my eye and gave me a small, pitying smile. In the past, that look would have mortified me, but now I simply met her gaze with a calm resolve she couldn't possibly understand. And I kept walking. The click of my heels on the marble floor was a steady, rhythmic count, marking my steps away from them toward myself. The valet brought my car around my beat-up Subaru, looking endearingly out of place. As I got in, the dam of control I had maintained finally broke. The tears came hot and silent, blurring the city lights into long watercolor streaks on the windshield. It was a grief so profound, it felt like it was being torn from the bedrock of my soul. I wept for the little girl who had just wanted her sister to play with her, for the teenager who had just wanted her parents to be proud of her passion. I wept for the illusion of family I had clung to for so long. But as I drove over the Fremont Bridge, the iconic green arches rising against the inky sky, another feeling began to bubble up through the sorrow. It was a wild, unfamiliar, and breathtaking sensation. It was relief. It was the feeling of a ship that has finally cut the anchor line, that has kept it tethered in a toxic harbor. The sea ahead might be stormy and unknown, but for the first time, it was free to find its own current. The tears were still falling, but now they felt different. They were a cleansing. I was broken open, yes, but I was also, for the first in my entire life, completely and utterly free. Back in my loft, the silence felt different. It had always been my companion, but tonight it felt like an ally, a co-conspirator. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the familiar shadowed space of my apartment, my sanctuary, and performed a simple ritual. I filled the kettle, measured out loose chamomile tea leaves, and waited for the water to boil. It was a simple act of self-care, a way of tending to my newly liberated self. Cradling the warm mug in my hands, I sat in my favorite armchair by the large window overlooking the city. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the infinite possibility of a blank page. For the first time, I wasn't just the curator of other people's stories. My kingdom wasn't just the shop below. It was my life, my choices, my integrity, my future. And in the quiet darkness, looking out at the city that was finally truly mine, I felt like its rightful queen. The first 24 hours of my freedom were a strange mix of profound peace and relentless assault. My phone, which I had left on silent, became a frantic buzzing beacon of my family's panic. I'd glance at the screen occasionally, a detached observer watching the storm rage from a safe distance. There was a barrage of texts from Kate, each one escalating in its fury. They began with accusations. "You have ruined this family," shifted to threats. "You'll regret this," and finally devolved into desperate wounded pleas. "How could you do this to me?" Interspersed were dozens of missed calls from my mother, her name flashing on the screen like a distress signal. I felt a pang of sadness for her, but it was a distant, muted ache. The immediate, suffocating need to manage her feelings was gone. I let the battery die. The next morning, I woke with the sun. The air in my loft felt lighter, cleaner. I made coffee, sat at the old oak desk in my living room, and for the first time I wrote back. Not a text message, not an emotional phone call, but a single carefully composed email addressed to all four of them. It was my declaration of independence. Dear Mom, Dad, Kate and Mark, I'm writing this because I believe we all deserve some form of clarity after the events of last night. I want to start by saying that in my own way, I love you. That is a truth that has made the last decade very difficult. But another truth is that the dynamic between us is broken. It has been for a long time. For years, my work and my passion were treated as a trivial hobby. I was measured against a standard of success I never aspired to, and was always found wanting. Last night, you discovered that my hobby had made me wealthy, and in an instant, your dismissal turned into demands. The hypocrisy of that is something I can no longer ignore. You cannot scorn the tree and then demand its fruit. My life, my choices, and my finances are my own. They are the result of my work, my risks, and my knowledge. They are not a family community chest. The pressure to make them so is something I will not accept. I need space to heal and to build a life on my own terms, free from judgment and expectation. I will reach out when and only when I am ready. Please respect that. Please do not try to contact me until then. Ellie. I read it over once, took a deep breath, and hit send. There was no anxiety, no regret. It felt like signing a treaty ending a long and painful war. With that done, I moved on to the practicalities. My first call was to Mr. Albright, my financial advisor. When he answered, his voice was its usual calm baritone. "Eleanor," he said, "I was expecting your call. I saw the email you sent this morning. Well done." I had copied him on it, a silent signal that things were changing. We scheduled a meeting for the following day with my lawyer. In that meeting, we built a fortress. We restructured trusts, rewrote my will, and strengthened the legal firewalls around every asset I owned. My lawyer called it aggressive estate planning. I called it peace of mind. But there was one more piece of foundational work to do, something far more important than legal documents. I had to address the ghost that sat at the heart of my fortune, the Civil War letters. The guilt from that transaction had been the silent fuel for my secrecy. Now I wanted to turn it into something real, something good. I researched local historical societies and found the Oregon Preservation Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to saving the state's heritage. I arranged a meeting with their director, a warm, intelligent woman named Dr. Anya Sharma. I told her I was an anonymous donor who wanted to establish a specific kind of fund. We called it the Vance Legacy Fund, a quiet nod to my father's name, to the better parts of my heritage. Its purpose was simple: to provide grants to the foundation, allowing them to acquire historical documents and artifacts from private citizens at fair market value. It would give them the power to approach families not as bargain hunters, but as partners in preservation. This is transformative, Ms. Vance Anya said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. This will save stories that would have been lost forever. In that moment, the weight of my moral debt didn't vanish, but it was transformed. It was no longer a source of shame, but a catalyst for good. The final piece of my new foundation was my chosen family. I called my two closest friends, Maria, a fiery ceramicist who owned a studio down the street, and Ben, a quiet, brilliant writer who practically lived at the coffee shop next door. They were the ones who had helped me haul furniture in the early days, who had celebrated my first big sale with cheap champagne, who had always seen the value in my work without ever knowing about the money. I met them for dinner at a noisy, crowded Thai restaurant, and over plates of spicy noodles, I told them everything. They didn't react with shock or greed. Maria's response was to raise her glass. To Ellie, she said, her dark eyes flashing. For finally telling the vipers to piss off. Ben simply reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We always knew you were a powerhouse, Elle, he said softly. They were just too blind to see it. In their easy acceptance, in their unconditional support, I felt the warm, sturdy embrace of real love. It wasn't based on blood or obligation. It was based on respect. As we sat there laughing and sharing stories, I knew I was home. I had built my sanctuary of artifacts, and now I was building a sanctuary of people. 6 months passed. Autumn bled into a damp Portland winter, which in turn gave way to the defiant green shoots of spring. In that time, my life settled into a new rhythm, one of my own making. The silence from my mother and sister was absolute. The boundary I had drawn was for the first time respected. I didn't know the details of what had happened to Kate and Mark's finances, and I discovered to my own surprise that I didn't care. Their story was no longer my story. My own narrative, however, was flourishing. Echoes and Artifacts became more than a shop. It became a hub. I started hosting small evening gatherings, a lecture on maritime history, a workshop on bookbinding, a poetry reading. The space filled with the kind of people I'd always wanted to be around, curious, passionate, and kind. My work with the Vance Legacy Fund was the quiet engine of my life. Through Anya, I heard stories of family histories preserved, of diaries saved from attics, and given the respect they deserved. I was balancing the scales not just for my own past, but for others, and it brought me a profound sense of purpose that my bank account never could. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in April, the air smelling of rain and cherry blossoms, that the small bell above my shop door chimed. I looked up from the delicate task of repairing the spine of an old book and saw my father standing there alone. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, the lines around his eyes deeper. He seemed uncertain, out of his element, clutching a newspaper under his arm like a shield. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet. "Hi, Dad," I replied, my own voice even. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I simply waited, allowing him to be the one to bridge the distance. He wandered through the aisles, his hands clasped behind his back, for the first time truly looking at the world I had built. He paused at a display of nautical instruments. He picked up a heavy brass-bound compass, turning it over in his hands. "This is beautiful," he said, breaking the silence. "Solid. Made to last. How can you tell if it's authentic?" It was a real question. A question born of curiosity, not judgment. I walked over and explained the maker's mark, the particular wear on the brass, the way the needle still sought north with an unwavering certainty. We talked for several minutes about celestial navigation, about the craftsmanship of a bygone era. It was the longest, most comfortable conversation we had ever had. Finally, he set the compass down carefully. He turned to me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The composure he had walked in with began to crumble. "Ellie," he began, his voice thick with an emotion it took me a moment to recognize as shame. "I'm sorry." The words were a ragged whisper. "For that night, and for all the years before it, I was always proud of you, of this place. But I was a coward. I let the noise, Kate's noise, your mother's anxieties, I let it all drown out my own voice. There's no excuse for it. But I am sorry. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase decades of feeling invisible. But it was honest. It was the truth. And in its raw, painful sincerity, it was more than I had ever expected to receive. I saw the immense, monumental effort it took for this quiet, reserved man to say those words, to admit his own failure. I didn't offer a grand, sweeping forgiveness. That would have felt false. Instead, I offered a simple present moment of connection. Would you like a cup of coffee, Dad? I asked softly. A flicker of surprise, then relief crossed his face. Yes, he said. I'd like that very much. I made 2 coffees on the small machine behind my counter, and we sat at a little round table I used for consultations. We didn't rehash the past. We talked about the present. He asked about the book I was repairing. I asked about his garden. We were not the all-powerful father and the disappointing daughter anymore. For the first time, we were just 2 adults sharing a quiet moment in a room full of history, tentatively building a new, more fragile bridge between us. After he left, a sense of profound peace settled over me. I walked over to my workbench, where an old Argus C3 film camera, a beautiful brick-like thing from the 1950s, was waiting for a new leatherette skin. I picked it up, its mechanical weight feeling solid and real in my hands. I raised it to my eye and looked through the small square viewfinder. Through the lens, the familiar street scene outside my window was slightly out of focus, the edges soft and blurry. But the small intricate details of the camera in my hands, the object of my immediate attention, were perfectly, exquisitely sharp and clear. A slow smile spread across my face. I finally understood. The real fortune was never the money. It was this. It was the ability to choose your own focus. To decide for yourself what was worth framing, what story was worth telling, and to gently let the rest of the world blur into the background. I was the curator not just of these objects, but of my own life. And the story was finally mine to write. Thank you for joining Ellie on her profound journey of self-discovery and quiet rebellion. Her story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important boundaries we set are with those closest to us, and that true wealth is measured in integrity, peace, and the freedom to write our own narrative. We know that themes of family dynamics being misunderstood and finding your own voice resonate deeply with so many of you. We'd love to hear your perspective. Have you ever felt that your passion was dismissed as just a hobby? What does it truly mean to choose yourself, especially when it's the hardest choice to make? And what do you think of the fragile reconciliation between Ellie and her father? Is forgiveness always the goal? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We believe every story matters, and we read every one. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of strength, resilience, and finding your voice. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of yourselves.